Hello, and thank you for listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard around the web on livingwealthyradio.com, iTunes, and Blog Talk Radio. I am Teresa Kuhn, helping you live wealthier. Resources are available for you at livingwealthyradio.com.
Do you struggle to get ahead, but it seems like you never can? Or do you sometimes wonder why the cost of living is so high and prices just keep climbing? Are you a senior who really can't afford to retire because you can't live off your fixed income savings? Or are you a millennial who can't really afford to buy a home? Is middle class now starting to feel the same as lower class? Well, whatever your income, it seems like you're having to work harder and harder just to stay in the same place. What exactly is going on? Who is to blame? And what can we do about it? Our guest today, Adam Taggart, is an expert on the financial and business sectors. He is president and co-founder of Peak Prosperity, and an experienced Silicon Valley executive who's here to share with us how Wall Street and the banking industry are robbing the American people and just what our options are. So welcome to Living Wealthy Radio, Adam.
Thank you, Teresa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Tell us a little bit about your journey from a Silicon Valley insider to your current role as a wealth protection strategist.
Sure. And I might even start a little bit sooner than my days on Silicon Valley, just to give you the full context here. I'm from a family of doctors and had always expected that I would become one myself. And as I was graduating from college back in the early 90s, it was when the Clintons were taking on reforming the healthcare industry then. And for better or worse, I listened to the doctors in my life who were afraid of where that industry was headed, and who encouraged me to take a few years before I got into medicine and to do something else to see how things would shake out. So I found myself at the end of my college career with having to figure out a different plan, because, of course, the plan had always been to go to medical school. And I ended up getting recruited out of college by one of the investment banking analyst programs on Wall Street. And so I spent my very early career as a junior investment banking analyst, and felt like that gave me a front row seat to all that is broken in the modern financial system. I think I would sum it up by saying, really, I learned firsthand that the banks do not exist to serve the interests of their clients, as they publicly state. They really exist to serve their own interests. And I didn't like what I saw there. I certainly didn't like the culture on Wall Street. And so I ejected from there and ended up going to Stanford to get my MBA, with the hopes that I'd find somewhere in business that would resonate more with my values and would make more of the type of difference in the world that I wanted to make. And while I was there at Stanford, the internet revolution happened. It was a very exciting time, and it was hard not to get wrapped up in that. And for a while, it actually really was changing the world. But as that industry began to mature, it became less about that and more about, hitting the numbers for the quarter that Wall Street was expecting you to hit. And by that time, I had been hired by Yahoo. And long story short, by the end of my time working at Yahoo, I had been reading, leading up to 2008, I'd been reading a lot of the voices on the internet that were warning about a housing bubble, warning about a larger economic bubble. And their logic made a lot of good sense to me. And increasingly, trying to get a few more people to use Yahoo Mail or play Yahoo Fantasy Sports on their mobile phone just didn't seem to make a big enough difference in the world, given the type of future that I thought was coming, given what these folks were predicting. And up until 2008, it was still a lot of theory, but that theory became very quickly validated as we entered the great financial crisis of 2008. And once that happened, it really solidified a lot of things that I had been wrestling with internally about where I thought the world was headed and the role I wanted to play in it. And I decided that just continuing to do what I was doing in the big corporate rat race was not meaningful to me personally, and it was not making a true difference in the world. And what I wanted to do was to try to help build awareness amongst the general public of these big trends that are at hand in the economy, and actually not just the economy itself. There are equally large trends happening in our energy systems and in the environment that we really need to know about in terms of our future quality of life. And I wanted to play an active role in helping people become aware of those trends and then making prudent decisions in their lives to take informed action based upon that information. And so I ended up partnering up with Chris Martenson, who was one of those people I had been reading leading up to the 2008 crisis, who was waving a very bright warning flag, warning folks about what was going to happen. Chris specifically authored the video series, The Crash Course, which some of your listeners might be familiar with, which I think even today is still the best articulation of really what's going on at the macro sense. And so Chris and I together co-founded Peak Prosperity to take that message more effectively to more people, and also put in a lot of solution content and guidance so that people can actually take specific action in their life based on all that. So that's kind of my whole life arc and why I've ended up where I am and doing what I'm doing.
So do you ever feel like people look at you and think you're wearing a tinfoil hat?
Absolutely. The one thing I'll say is fewer and fewer people are looking at me and Chris and those in our field like that these days. I'm not saying that a lot of people still don't, but they certainly did when we were, warning about this information 10 years ago, when it still felt, fairly foreign to people. But I think more and more people have seen evidence manifest in their own lives, whether it was losing their job after 2008 or seeing their home price take a big hit in the first few years after the crisis started, or whether it's seeing the sluggishness of the U.S. economy, that despite all of the money printing that's gone on by the central banks, we're still chugging along at subpar GDP rates. So there's a lot of manifestations here that more and more people are beginning to know in their guts and sometimes even in their minds that, something isn't really quite right here, that things aren't really going as well as the mainstream media is purporting to us. And more of what used to be part of our core message that was regarded as really fringe is making its way into the mainstream narrative. And not completely yet, but what's interesting is where I think we were very firmly kind of placed in the doomsday prepper, tinfoil hat wearing camp 10 years ago, we're much more now seen as a voice that at least deserves, some consideration in the national narrative, which I think is a big positive change.
Absolutely. And I'm one of those who was perceived as wearing the tinfoil hat. Actually, I discovered that what I had been taught in finance school and law school about how the system works, banking works, money works, was a big fat lie, thanks to G. Edward Griffin. When I first was introduced to him back then. And over the years, it's become more, at least I meet more and more people that may not understand the depth of what we as researchers and as students of this genre, so to speak, have discovered. But they get there's a lot wrong and there's a lot of lies and misinformation out there. That much they get.
Oh, absolutely. And, if you're a member of the middle class, it's become abundantly clear over the past 10, 15 years that, in many ways, there's almost an all-out war on the middle class, that it's becoming an endangered species, that we're really bifurcating into an economy of haves and have-nots. And if you're a millennial who's graduating, I mean, this isn't even really, I think, a gray area for them. They look at the world that they're being asked to step into, where, hey, we're going to charge you an arm and a leg for college. We're going to make you take on excessive debts that, by the way, aren't dischargeable in personal bankruptcy. And you're going to step into an economy that, is chugging along at subpar growth rates. By the way, the hiring market isn't so great because the seniors can't afford to retire. We're outsourcing a lot of jobs, and increasingly we're automating them with robotics and AI. So, forget about having job security, or forget about having, competitive wages in the marketplace. And by the way, while we're asking you to do all that, housing prices have escalated to the point where there's absolutely no way you're going to be able to afford to buy one. And all the time, we're going to ask you to be picking up the tab for paying for the retirements of the baby boomers, many of whom didn't plan for retirement, and paying for the tab for our crumbling national infrastructure that we haven't invested in. So congratulations. There you go, kid. So it's a story that sadly is finally becoming more and more obvious to more and more parts of society.
And it's really quite sad, because I think the millennials are going to be the first generation is going to be the first generation that will not have a higher standard of living than their parents. I think that might be, and if not millennials, maybe Generation X, right? That their future is not as bright as their parents.
Well, that's very true, and I would say that Generation X probably is actually going to be the winner of that mantle of the first generation to live with less prosperity than their parents. I think the millennials, that's an absolute certainty. And part of that is the boomers were alive at a magical time for human beings, especially if you lived in America, right? America had an unbelievable amount of prosperity, a lot of which was due to the rich natural resources of America and technology innovations, but certainly also because most of the other world economies were in disrepair after World War II. Also, through the lens we look at peak prosperity, there was a long multi-decadal stretch of essentially, limitless cheap energy in the form of cheap oil. The whole petro dollar regime came into full force during their generation, and much through their lifetime. The world was producing more and more energy for cheaper and cheaper rates. And so they had that massive tailwind at their back. We're living in an era now where we're bumping up against limits to growth, planetary limits with resources in certain cases. And we're certainly entering an era where we are it's getting harder and harder to kick the can for a lot of the excesses of the past. And so I think at a base level, both economically and with a growing amount of natural resources, we're beginning to face the time where we've been living above our means for too many generations. And at some point, you can't do that forever. And mathematically, to get back to a sustainable level, if you've been living above your means, you actually need a period of living below them for a while until things can stabilize. And of course, nobody wants to do that. No politician obviously wants to preside over that. And so we've just been in this can-kicking mode for the past couple of decades. And the big question here is when do we get to the point where that can really can't be kicked anymore? And when those repercussions start manifesting, how fast will that be, and at what extent will they manifest? That's a lot about what we do at Peak Prosperity, is trying to look at the most recent data and project out probabilities. But at a big level, with certainty, we can say a lot of these things are not going to be able to continue the way that they have for much of the past couple of decades. And so, one of our little quirky catchphrases is, the next 20 years is going to be completely unlike the past 20 years. And the reason for that is because it simply can't. We have way too many excesses that have to be cleared from the system in one way, shape, or form. And while our leaders have been doing their absolute best to push those consequences off into the future, we're getting to the point where we're entering the future where those consequences can't be pushed anymore.
So keeping it high level for one more moment, do you think that what's occurred, from the baby boomers, from the most prosperous era probably in the history of the world to where we are today, was all part of a deliberate plan?
I think the honest answer is I don't know. There are people out there who talk about the globalist agenda. And I can certainly say that there are probably components of that are quite true. I look at it more, I think, and sadly, I think it is really just a study in human nature and, the way in which we're programmed from our early evolutionary times is, we were programmed to consume when there was stuff to consume because, you might catch a mastodon today and might not catch another one for another couple of weeks. So as a society, I think we're biologically wired to gorge ourselves. And we had many, many things to gorge ourselves on. And again, sort of how the human brain is wired, we're really good at reacting to immediate visible risks. We're quite bad about planning for avoiding long-term risks that aren't immediately visible. And so I think in this case, it's just our nature somewhat working against us where we always made sort of the selfish, short-sighted decision. And that was really fun. And that got people elected and kept them in power. And it felt fun at the time to the people who were enjoying that pulling of prosperity from the future into the present. But like I said earlier, those decisions have consequences, and we're finally getting to the point where we can't just keep partying. It's where we have to actually start being a little bit responsible. And that's not popular, and it's not something politicians like doing. But I think increasingly we're going to be forced to make the responsible decisions that we should have made decades ago. It's just the consequences of those decisions are a lot higher now.
What about today, looking at today moving forward, do you feel that there is a concerted plan, strategy to minimize the middle class or widen the gap between the lower income and the very, very wealthy with policies and politics around targeting the middle class and making them less affluent so that the wealthy or those in power have more power and more opportunity?
I do. I don't know, and I'm just being transparent about it. I don't have enough data to say that it's all part of some grand plan for, enslaving, the 99%. But I can tell you that the outcome is going to be the same. And, what I mean by that is, I keep saying that we've pulled prosperity from the future into the present, and going forward, we're going to have less prosperity, and therefore we're going to have to make tougher and tougher decisions. We're getting to the point where those that are at the top end of the system, they have been getting the lion's share of the prosperity, and of course, they are reinvesting that prosperity into increasing their share of the pie. Right, so they're getting the rules written more in their favor. They're funding politicians to get into office who will then pass legislation that'll be favorable to the interests of these elites. And again, I think that's largely all just sort of general human nature. But what's happening now is we're getting to the point where the overall pie itself can no longer grow from these limits, and those at the top are not going to willingly allow their slices to shrink. As a matter of fact, if the pie is growing and the elites still want to get greater prosperity, they're going to actually do everything they can to increase their slice. But of course, it's a slice of a pie that's no longer growing, may actually be shrinking. And so the net impact of that is that you're taking from everybody else. And so I think that that's the phase that we are entering into now, where the elites are saying, hey, it's getting harder and harder to continue gaining the riches that I've been getting at the same rate I've been getting them, but I'm going to keep reinvesting all my energies to make that continue for as long as possible. And since they've got so many advantages, they're going to win out over the smaller classes, and they're going to be stealing from them. And so it's going to effectively create what you talked about there, which is an increasingly bifurcated system where it's a very, very small number of people and institutions that are hoovering up the vast, vast majority of assets and resources at the expense of everybody else. And so, we'll see the middle class dwindle and then eventually evaporate. And, for me as a student of all this, the big question is at what point does the rest of the world, the remaining 99% or 99.9%, rise up and say, this is unfair, let's change the game here. And I got to tell you, I remain surprised at times that it hasn't happened already. I'm trying to remember the exact numbers here, and I'm probably not going to get them well, but I think it was in 2015, Oxfam did a study of global wealth inequality, and 61 people owned as much of the world's wealth as the bottom 50%. And then in 2016, they reran the same survey, and it was now 8 people who owned as much as the bottom 50% of the world, which shows you just how fast this wealth is concentrating into smaller and smaller hands. So, when you get to a point where 8 people own as much as half the planet, you're really going to ask yourself, when are people going to say enough is enough, right? When are we going to say that's just grossly unfair? Clearly, we're not at that level yet, but at some point we will get there. It's happened many, many times throughout history. So just being really specific, I mean, there are absolutely very conscious decisions being made right now to sacrifice the middle and lower classes for the benefit of the upper classes. And we can talk about several of them if you like, but I think a really clear one is the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy. The Federal Reserve, will titularly say that it has brought interest rates down and pushed liquidity in the markets to stave off a prolonged recession. But there's a very good argument on the other side of that, which is that, hey, by trying to actually prevent business cycles from happening naturally, the Fed is creating, worse downturns when downturns inevitably happen, and its meddling is actually making things worse. But for sure, as the Fed has been trying to, clean up its mess from helping create the 2008 credit crisis, it has been flooding the world with liquidity, which is, devalue the purchasing power of our individual dollars. And so if you have fewer dollars, you feel that loss of purchasing power more acutely. But it's been keeping rates at historically low and I just think quite ridiculous levels for much too long. And it has destroyed the incentive for saving. There's really no reason for a prudent person to save anymore when you're getting, I just checked at my local Wells Fargo savings bank, my savings account there. It's getting 0.06% return on savings, which is effectively zero. So I'm putting my money in a bank that's charging me fees, both overt and hidden, giving me withdrawal limitations on that account. And is obviously, has the risk out there someday if we enter another crisis and there's a bank bail-in, I could lose some of that money or all of it. And for that, for that benefit, I'm getting a 0.06% return, which means if I put $100,000 in that account for a year, I get $60 back. Certainly not worth it, given those risks. And what that does for the average person is it just kills them. I mean, the average pensioner, living on a fixed income, they're just getting no return on that, right? In the old days, you could live off of a 6-7% return, which is what savings accounts, used to offer back in the 80s. Nowadays, you can't earn anything off of a 0.06% return. And of course, that's the nominal return. So when you add inflation into the mix, let's take the government's official inflation stats for the last 12 months. That's 2.2%. So subtract that from 0.06, you get a negative 2.14% real return on your savings. So you're actually just you're losing purchasing power by keeping your money there in the bank. And of course, we all know that the official inflation rate is grossly understated. So the picture is even more dire than that. So that's a very conscious decision that the Fed has made to basically say, look, we're going to keep the banks fat and happy at the expense of the general public who, depends on savings for building capital to do the things that they want to do in their lives, like buy homes and save for the future. And we're going to throw grandma under the bus. And we're basically going to sacrifice all the seniors who live on a fixed income in the interest of preserving this, this elite financial system for the too big to fail banks and the people who get first access to all that money printed by the bank, which is not the little folks like you or I.
Boy, you've said so much. There's so many directions I can take this conversation. And I'll go to human behavior for one, right? It's uncanny how you look at the psychology or human behavior when it comes to money. And I think one of the reasons why most people aren't demanding a change is because they're totally distracted and they have amnesia. And the Federal Reserve policies encourage people to invest because they know they can't make any money on their bank accounts or in their savings accounts. And Wall Street is at an all-time high. Mm-hmm. And so they've forgotten what it felt like when Wall Street was down, right, and they lost money. They've forgotten what it means to have the pain of looking at their portfolios and it's 30, 40, 50% of the value they thought it should be. They forget the real estate crisis. They just know that today Wall Street's up, their portfolios look like they're up, and so what if they can't get, a nice return in their bank, right? And they're also very distracted by social media and by sports and by, the drama with the politics. It's all a big distraction.
Well, it goes back to the old bread and circuses from Roman times, right?
Exactly.
It's keep your populace distracted, and they hopefully won't, pay attention to what you're doing in the background to transfer the wealth to, yourself and your cronies, which is exactly what's going on here. Yeah, and it's interesting. So there are you're exactly right. What the Fed is doing here is called pushing people out along the risk curve, right? It's trying to get them out of safer assets and trying to force the money into where the Fed wants it to go, which is into the assets that the wealthy own, right? Which are, stocks and real estate and things like that. That's all great for everybody who's participating as long as the game continues. And, what's interesting and sad is we don't have the participation on the retail side with the average investor at this point that we did back leading up to the 2008 crisis. So the people who are still invested in the market, whether it's through their 401ks or whatever other savings they may have, they're now happy enough with several years of the market hitting record high year after year, similar with housing. But there's a lot of people that have been lost from the middle class and from that average investor pool since 2008. So there's, for every person who's, still got a portfolio and still owns their house, there's at least another person there who got forced into becoming a renter or never put their money back into the market because they either lost so much or they're now just very understandably distrustful of the markets. And so, those people are really seeing a world of hurt right now because they've gotten, no return from their investment portfolio side of things, and rents have skyrocketed right along with housing prices. And so, those people are really getting it from both ends, where they're not getting any savings return. They're not getting wage growth return. So on the income side, they're really stagnating. And then on the cost side, they're seeing their costs increase dramatically, multiples more than what the official government is claiming is the inflation rate and the cost and the general increase in cost of living. As I said earlier, the government's calculations, it's somewhere around 2%. If you're somebody who has to pay healthcare, has to pay rent, has to buy food at the grocery store, you realize that number is probably much more like 6 or 7% annually. And that's if you're lucky, particularly around healthcare these days. So, it's really a combination of, push people's money where you want it to be, and then distract them with, meaningless controversies or meaningless entertainments, so that, they remain, distracted enough that they're not, waking up to this stuff. And what's interesting is, there's more going on here than what we've just talked about, and certainly one thing that's going on right now is something called financial repression, which sounds like a general term, but it's actually a very specific term. It's a playbook that governments have used again and again throughout history to deal with excessive debts that they've racked up over time, which is exactly where we are right now. And what financial repression involves is manipulating interest rates and bringing them down to artificially low areas, and then providing or putting in preventative measures for capital to escape. So in other words, making it hard for people to move their money out of the country. Well, if anybody has foreign investments and have had to comply with FATCA, you've got a sense that the government is making it harder and harder to keep money outside of the U.S. borders. If you are investing in things like precious metals, one, they have higher taxes placed on their gains, and secondly, anybody that follows the precious metals markets, it's very, very hard not to conclude that those markets are heavily manipulated to the downside to control the price of gold and silver and prevent people from finding safety there. We talked earlier about how just trying not to play the game and putting your money into a bank savings account is nowadays a losing proposition. So the government is ring-fencing your money, and it's pushing it into where it needs it to go and wants it to go. At the same time, by keeping interest rates that low, what the government essentially is doing is allowing itself to keep issuing more and more debt to fund what it's doing, to deficit fund what it's doing, which essentially is just pulling in prosperity from the future and consuming it today. And what that process does is it ends up, at the end of the day, devaluing the currency that is underlying the debt. It does that at the same time while making those debt interest payments lower for the government to have to make. And so essentially what all this does is it transfers the cost of the debt from the government to the populace's savings. And that's what's going on right now. And the challenge is it's so just enough removed in terms of it's not a direct theft. It's an indirect way to siphon off that purchasing power from the average saver, that it's not noticeable to the general public. It's just confusing enough. It's just hidden enough that it's not something they notice until, of course, it's way too late. And so that's exactly what's going on here right now. It's a very nefarious process where it's kind of that sort of frog in the boiling pot process where for the average person, it's just one little new regulation here or one little new inconvenience here. Interest rates go down a little bit. They go down a little bit more. And you don't quite notice that it's happening in real time. You just over the years begin to feel this sense of it's just getting harder and harder and harder to get by. And I wonder why. Well, as we're talking about, it's no accident of fate. It is something that is being very deliberately conducted, and it's being conducted by our leaders expressly for the reason of allowing them to keep the current game going on for at least another year, 2 years longer. And that game is enriching themselves by taking your wealth and transferring it to them in a way that's just complex enough that hopefully you won't catch on to it. So
where do you think Americans should position whatever wealth they've got today?
If
it's not in the banks and it's not in Wall Street, what other options are there?
Well, I'm going to give the short story, which is a little commercial for a book that my partner, Chris Martinson, and I wrote a little over a year ago called Prosper, which addresses this exact question head on. Just to give you the tagline of the book, it's called How to Prepare for the Future and Create a World Worth Inheriting. And it's a way in which we give a direct roadmap to people on very actionable steps they can take around these issues, and to do so with positivity, because a lot of people get wrapped up in a lot of fear around this. Fear that, A, they're going to be a victim, but also fear, too, that really bad things could happen societally going forward in case we have massive crashes, massive depressions, whatnot. And I'm not saying that there isn't risk of certain of those things happening, but there is a way that my partner and I very much believe that we can take control in large parts of our own destinies here and look to the future with a sense of hope and excitement versus a sense of dread, which is where we see a lot of people getting stuck. But to get to your question specifically, so yes, first is obviously, arm yourself with knowledge about what's going on at the macro level, so you can sort of understand the rules of the game that you're being forced to play here. On the money side of things, and I'm just going to make a quick little note that a really important part of our view is that you really need to expand your definition of an investment beyond just money and, how many dollars you have in your bank account. But I'll get to that in just a moment. When it comes to wealth, our wealth is being siphoned away. It's being manipulated. It's being literally inflated away. And so our big advice is position your wealth in a way where it's much harder for those in power to do that. And by that we mean try to invest in assets that are not easily inflatable away. Or what do I mean by that? Well, 100 years ago, if you walked into a town and asked somebody, hey, who's the richest guy in town here? That answer would have been pretty easy. They would have pointed, to some direction and said, oh, it's that guy over there. And the answer why would have been because that guy has the most land. Right? Back then, productive land was the clear sign of wealth. And at Peak Prosperity, we define wealth into three classifications. There's primary wealth, which is the natural product produced by nature. So this is the veins of ore that are in the ground. These are fertile fields. These are running streams of potable water. These are strands of timber. That's primary wealth. Then there's secondary wealth, which is what is the thing you make from primary wealth? Well, so with timber, that becomes lumber, that then becomes, buildings and housings and things like that. With ore, that becomes steel, right? We create productive factories out of those materials. With land, it becomes the food that makes its way to our grocery stores and our kitchen tables and whatnot. We look at secondary wealth still as a form of tangible wealth. And then you look at tertiary wealth, which is really what most of us now think of when we think of wealth. This is the financialized version of wealth, which really came into play over the past 50, 60, 70 years. And these are paper claims either on secondary wealth or primary wealth. And simply put, what's happened here is we now live in an era of over-financialization where there are way more paper claims on the underlying assets than there are assets themselves. So where I'm going with all this is we recommend that people try to shift their wealth from the paper side of things back to the tangible side of things, and look for ways to, have direct ownership of primary wealth or secondary wealth. And so this might be, investing locally into local businesses that know in your area. You're a direct investor. You actually can see how that capital is being put to use. Those are creating income streams for you. Real estate investing is actually a form of this that's relatively available to a large swath of the investing population. Speaking of primary wealth, probably the easiest way to do that is to own some gold and silver bullion. Right? That's a very easy way to get direct ownership of that commodity. But certainly there are ways to invest in farmland, invest in timberland, purchase water rights, things like that. So there's a whole host of different asset classes there to invest in. It's just not as known to the average investor, and it's a little bit more complicated. It's not as easy as going to E-Trade and buying a share of Tesla stock with a click of a mouse. It does take a little bit more work and a little bit more due diligence, but it is eminently doable. And it's a way to position your wealth into financial capital that can't just be, double, tripled in size over the next couple of years by a central banking cartel that just wants to print up additional trillions, which is what they've been doing for the past several years.
How much time do you think we have before, the walls come crumbling down?
Crumbling down. Yeah, that's a great question. It's the one that everybody wants to know the answer to. And I will tell you, anybody who gives you an answer that sounds like it's got a level of certainty behind it is fooling both you and themselves. But from our perspective, Chris is is a scientist and I'm an empiricist. We're very data-driven guys, and we talk a lot about probabilities. I think the probability of another sort of 2008 style major market correction is unacceptably high at this point. And in terms of a time frame, I personally feel very comfortable putting it within the next 5 years. If I had to put a finer beat on that in terms of, do I think it'll be more at the beginning of the next 5 years, the end of the next 5 years, I think within the next 2 years is where I'm personally positioning my portfolio with that in mind. Is it something that could happen tomorrow? Absolutely. So, our general viewpoints, which I try to practice on a regular basis, is it's much, much better to be positioned a year early than to try to position yourself a day late. So, I think right now, if you're an investor, we've long passed the time, I think, for positioning yourself defensively. And that can be, selling your paper positions and getting out of the market and getting into the more types of tangible assets that I was talking about. Or it could be, putting some of your portfolio into a hedge position where you're actually actively, set to profit in case of a market downturn. I think if you haven't taken either of those steps, it is long overdue for you to sit down with a professional financial advisor and have that discussion about how much of that you should consider doing now. I'm not trying to scare folks, and I'm not saying don't have any long positions in this market. Although, being perfectly honest with your listeners, I don't have any myself. But I think that you need to be prepared today for a minimum, 20% market correction. You don't necessarily have to, bet on the downturn today in terms of taking the short side of that trade, but you need to have answered the question for yourself: if the market were to start correcting 20% tomorrow, am I positioned enough today where I've minimized my downside, or I've at least positioned myself that my losses will be acceptable to me given my risk profile. Given the people that we talk about on a daily basis here at Peak Prosperity, I think, I feel pretty safe saying 99% of America who is still invested in this market has not had that conversation with themselves yet.
Well, it's so interesting the way you position that. Again, so many different ways I can go. I can take the conversation, but I interview some of the most brilliant minds in economics and finance, and everyone has a really good prediction or idea as to what's going to happen and when, with a disclaimer, right? And they've got great arguments as to why. And then we see what's happened in the last 7 years with Wall Street, and it makes absolutely no sense, right? But we know eventually things have to blow up. And regarding taking a short position in the market, I am not Wall Street licensed on purpose. That's not the type of strategies I work with. But if anyone has seen the movie The Big Short, there's the guy who shorts the market, and he just does it a little early. He sees the indicators. He knows what's going to happen. He just was a little bit premature, right? And so shorting the market can also be a dangerous thing, because if you had shorted the market 3 years ago with very good reason, knowing that it's going to blow up at some point in time, you'd be hurting right now, or out of your position because you can't afford to keep it.
Absolutely. There's the old adage that the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, which I think every investor, long or short, needs to always have at the forefront of their mind. No, very, very true. And, since we're putting the disclaimers out here, I'm not encouraging people to rush out and get short positions. And if you do, again, definitely do that under the guidance of a seasoned and experienced financial professional. And for some people, I think, having a little bit of that in having a little short position in your portfolio makes sense. One is a little bit, for those that can afford to speculate with that percentage of their portfolio, sure, that makes sense if you want to go there. I think it's just a sensible form of insurance if you are long in that portfolio, like most people who are, have most of their funds, their retirement funds in a 401k or whatnot, where they're usually generally limited to, one of 5 or 6 funds that the retirement plan offers. So if you have a small short position in another brokerage account or something that you have, it's just providing some general diversification. But yes, I think the key word that I've been using here, which I hope I've used a couple of times, is defense. So this is a real time for defense. And so while cash in the bank is not offering you much at all, and I started our whole conversation off with that, there are times where no return is better than a negative return. And I will admit I'm actually pretty heavily cash right now and also heavy precious metals. And that's just because I feel like we are at the point here where having dry powder is the safe place to be, both in terms of safe from, if the market corrects in the manner that I think it will. And if it does, then if you've got that capital that's been set aside and placed in reserve, if the correction is as large as I think it could be, or certainly if it's as large as I think it should be, there are going to be some fantastic investing opportunities here once the dust settles. And of course, you can only participate in those if you've kept your capital safe. So I certainly, the thing I do feel really comfortable recommending to people is this is a time to play it safe. It is a time to trade off upside potential for limiting your downside exposure.
Absolutely. So it's been a great conversation. I so appreciate your perspective and your history and your background, right? And how you've taken this field, this perspective on the financial systems and investing and what's coming. It's a very credible, grounded perspective that I so appreciate. I think your message is a wake-up call about our country's financial system. The deck is certainly stacked against us, right? And our standard of living is certainly declining. The banks aren't playing fair. It's up to us to take responsibility for our future, educate ourselves. You've got a great course. You've got some great resources to do that. And your website is peakprosperity.com. Any parting words or anything else you'd like to share before we sign off today?
Sure. Well, first, just to thank you for inviting me on. This has been a great discussion, and I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. It's fun. And I agree with you. I think that the parting thing that people should take from this is this is a time for action. We are not being told the true state of the world, as you said earlier. And so, and a really important part of that action is getting educated. And so whether it's folks listening to your podcasts or coming to Peak Prosperity and reading a little bit, or going to the other many sites on the internet that are in our space that are trying to surface this information, I think that's a huge benefit to yourself, is to get out there and read that information, become self-educated, and then use that information to take actual prudent steps now in your life for the types of risks that we see coming. Information by itself is useless if it's not put into application. And not educating yourself, ignoring this information, is a decision in itself. And given, Teresa, I think your perspective and mine, folks that don't plan for what we believe might be coming, if they're caught by it unprepared, that's not going to be a nice place to be. So my strong encouragement to folks here is to get out there, educate yourself, and then ask, okay, what smart action should I take based upon what I've learned?
You've been listening to Living Wealthy Radio, heard around the web on livingwealthyradio.com, iTunes, and Blog Talk Radio. Download or subscribe to our podcast to hear a new show every week. I am Teresa Kuhn, and I hope you'll join me again next week as I show you ways to live wealthier. Resources are available for you on our website at livingwealthyradio.com.